So my name is Gabi Reigh, and I was born in Romania, where I lived until the age of 12. When I moved to the UK, I studied English and history of art at university, and then became an English teacher. And after many years of doing that, I started translating books from the interwar period. And all the books that my family had on their bookshelves, and all the books that I wanted to read, and the latest of which is Liviu Rebreanu's Ciuleandra.
Excellent. And my name is George Sipos, in Romanian, George Sipos. I was born in Romania as well. I went to the University of Bucharest to do my undergrad degree in Japanese language and literature. And immediately after graduation, I got a scholarship at the University of Pittsburgh to do a master's degree in Japanese literature. And I continued with a doctoral degree at the University of Chicago, as well in the United States. I've been in the United States ever since, with 2-3 years stints in Japan. I lived in Japan for about 8.5 years of those. My specialty is actually interwar Japan, but I continue to remain heavily invested in interwar Romania. And that's for good reason, because I think there's a lot of connections there between Romania and Japan. And, you know, I won't say more about that before I actually have a good research out there, a comparative research between interwar Japan and Romania. I work a lot on censorship, on dictatorship, militarism, imperialism in Japan, and I work on resistance through literature and arts to dictatorship as a scholar. And my first co-edited book is coming out in June at Routledge. It will be a book on 1930s Japan, but I continue to work a lot and translate and comment on Romanian literature as well, which is, of course, a way to sort of stay connected with that side of me, right? So that's me.
I was thinking this is our first proper chat, like almost a real chat on Zoom, George, but we've actually been exchanging emails about Ciuleandra for the last couple of years. And so, like we're saying, I'm a Romanian living in the UK, you're a Romanian living in the US, and Edward Lipset, who is the publisher as well of Cadmus Press, he's an American living in Japan.
Correct.
So it's been quite exciting, really, to see us all thinking about Ciuleandra. And I hope that's kind of what I really hope, that through translating it into English, we're going to have that on a slightly bigger scale than just 3 people talking about Ciuleandra. That we can at least double that, and we can have a few more people being introduced, I think, to this great work. But I wanted to start actually by asking you, how did you come to love Ciuleandra? When was it the first time that you read it?
Oh yeah, that's that takes me back, I guess. It must have been when I was about 15. I think that I encountered Rebreanu, and there's a funny story about that, because of course everybody at 15, 16 studies the Rebreanu's big novel, right? The Uprising, Răscoala. And you have to study it in high school. I mean, and some people love it, some people hate it. And I loved it from the beginning. It was a monumental work to me that captured something about the essence of Romania, of the Romanian peasant. And there was a tension there that immediately attracted me, right? And what I determined to do, I got very keen on understanding Ion and Răscoala. And with that, I said, okay, well, how many novels does Rebreanu have? I'm going to read them all. And I actually finished them within a week. I read all of them, all 9 of them. And then I understood, reading the literary criticism and the historical positioning of Rebreanu, the importance of all these experimentations that he's made. And Ciuleandra was part of that. And it really stuck with me because there was a tension, right? And there's always a tension in Rebreanu's novels. There's a tension between this core, this Romanianness, let's say, of the peasant, and then the upper level society. And, you know, in a very strange way, that fit the pre-1989 discourse. There is a lot of discourse about Rebreanu being sort of an avant-garde, visionary type of literature, because he understood the social order and the social tensions and all that. And of course, from a Marxist dialectical perspective, that makes perfect sense. But you have to look at it from a different angle as well. And I think Ciuleandra is fascinating because it looks at the tensions inside interwar Romania. And I remain a big fan. And you know, I read it in French afterwards. I read it in English. It has its own charm in either language. But I think in Romanian is also an excellent piece of work.
Yes, I was thinking actually maybe we ought to give a very brief overview of the novel without completely spoiling the plot for those who haven't read it. But so I guess it's about somebody from the aristocracy, like you said, a young aristocrat, Puiu Faranga, son of a former minister, so somebody very well positioned in society, who kills his peasant-born wife, which is where the tensions that we're going to be talking about the urban world, the rural world, the aristocracy and the peasantry, that's I suppose at the core of the plot of the book. And this young man is helped by his father to try to evade justice for his crime by being sent to a sanatorium. That is run by one of his father's colleagues. So we've got kind of this theme of potential corruption there. But sanatorium, the young man, the young aristocrat, starts to think about his life, think about his crime, and to try to understand himself and why he did what he did. So yes, so I mean the tensions that you mentioned as well between the peasants and the rural world and the aristocracy, I think you can see that from the very plot of the book, from the murder, which I think is a very interesting thing. Yes, I mean, I was one of the things that I noticed, you know, obviously I've been translating a few different interwar texts, and the latest ones that I did were the novels of Mihail Sebastian. They are quite different actually in many ways. I mean, not just I think in terms of the style. I think you know, Mihail Sebastian's style was a lot more understated. There's a greater sense of irony and coolness and detachment in the way that he describes emotions. I think with Rebreanu, everything is obviously a lot more heightened. You know, it starts right in the middle of a murder. So clearly you're going to have these very, very intense emotions. And I think that's the thing that makes the book so memorable. I mean, you said that you read it when you were 15. I have to confess that I hadn't actually read it until I decided to translate it, so much later. But I knew the plot. I don't know how I knew the plot, because like I said, it could have only been because I saw the film in Romania, but that would have been before the age of 12. But there's something about it that's so vivid because of those heightened emotions, because of emotions that sometimes touch on melodrama. And there's almost, in terms of genre, it reminds me a bit of like 19th century sensation novels, because obviously all the kind of the themes, the murder, the passion, but also, you know, the coincidences. So my husband's reading it at the moment, and I'm expecting him to kind of come back to me and to say, yeah, how is that all these people that know each other end up in the sanatorium? How is it that everybody is connected? But I guess that's part of the symbolic message of the book, isn't it, as well? It's about the connections between the boyars, about the aristocracy, and this the peasantry, and also about the social mobility that was happening at that point. And the ways in which these people, you know, from Madalina's village can now move to Bucharest. The war has had a big part in that, in creating this disruption in terms of people's lives anyway. And so it's looking at the shortcomings as well as the benefits, I think, of this social mobility, and the way that that also threatens the privileges and the sense of power of the aristocracy. Because I don't know what you think, but to me, I think a lot of it is a novel about some, you know, the power of this system, of this establishment that is being threatened. And I think that to some extent, that's where the killer instinct comes from. I mean, what do you think about the key themes in the way of the book?
I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. I think that's exactly right. You got it absolutely right. That's exactly what the book is about. It's that tension between these sort of established conservative, already in place nobility, aristocracy, and these up and coming a new class of people coming into the cities, coming into urban life. I mean, we're looking at a tension between the rural and the urban, and of course, Rebreanu is a master a describer of that tension in all of his books. I mean, he looks at that consistently, maybe except for the love novels and so on, the romance novels. But what's also very important here is this back and forth between the rural and the urban. And the rural, of course, is associated with the peasants, most of them tenant peasants, tenant farmers, people without their own land, people who are in a position to work not for their own benefit but for others, and so on. And then the boyars. And I think it's interesting to look at the boyars. The boyars are, so Faranga, the father, is keenly aware of the issues of his own class, but he thinks they're biological. He doesn't understand that they're social, political, economic. He believes that the major problem is that their blood is being dissolved and thinned through centuries of intermarriage, and I kind of like that piece that they look, it's kind of like their own trip into the heart of darkness, if you will. They go into the village and they go deep into the village, and then they're hungry. So there's like a physical thing, and then it gets into the dance. And the dance, what they want to do with the dance is, I think that they're overpowered by the emotions behind it. They're overpowered by the violence behind it, and they want to own it because that's their instinct. And this is what happens. There's this back and forth where Puiu, as the next generation, so to speak, of boyars of this establishment, is coming in trying to violate and produce violence into this dance. And I think that's the key metaphor there, because he continues to want to possess that. There is something about that peasantness, that energy that Rebreanu translates into the dance that he wants to possess. And in the end, they're taming. You see, you're looking at a taming of a peasant, right? Of a young peasant woman who's being tamed. It's like a rewriting of the My Fair Lady, if you will. I'm gonna make her into a noble woman. But she does become a noble woman, but she lost something, right? She's lost that energy. She's lost that warmth, that phenomenal love that connected her with the ground, with the earth, with her peasant roots, and basically you're seeing a slave person, a person who's been bought from her parents, transformed by force, but losing herself, disappearing as a human being. And I think that what Puiu sees in that is he hates that new person, because he hates himself. Ultimately, this is what the murder is against. It's against himself, right? And that's where the tension is for me in Ciuleandra. And it's interesting, by the way, because I want to sort of ask this of you. You decided to keep the title in Romanian. Do you think that's going to be? Is that? I mean, depending on the time that you look at the translations, sometimes you have translations through, And I know we had a discussion about this, but you can just talk about Ciuleandra itself and how you chose it. Yeah.
Yeah, I did, as you know, we were playing around with different titles, weren't we? And I did think of possibly changing it as well to Dance Macabre, which I think works on some levels. It works on the sense that it's a dance. It works in the sense that it's about fate as well, and it's about kind of doom, and so I thought I quite like that connection. I think in the end, enough people talk me out of it, so which is good, because it's about how an audience would react to it. And my concern originally was to do with this idea that Ciuleandra, it's going to be how are people going to almost like hear about how they're going to pass on the word about this book. I read this great book, I can't remember the name by this writer, I can't remember the name of the writer, you know, it was to some extent about making it accessible to an English speaking audience. But I decided, I'm pleased in the end what we did. I'm pleased that we decided to kind of keep the normal title as well, because it is the book that people know. It's the book that, you know, before I started translating these books, I was Googling these books, and I was looking them up on Amazon to see if they're available. And that's partly why I've started doing the translations, because there weren't, you know, and I know Ciuleandra has been translated before, and it's a great shame that I didn't even know about it, in fact, when I started doing it, and that these things aren't really available. So there are hopefully still going to be people who might have heard of this book because it's a classic. They might want their you know, friends to read it, and you know, or their partners, their English-speaking friends or partners to read it, or their children, or whatever. And they might be looking for this book because it is an important book. But yes, but I just want to come back to something that you were saying as well about the themes, and you know, it's one of these things that may be one of the things that makes it so powerful. It is because it's about possession, isn't it? And about it's about love to some extent. It's about obsession. It's about instinct, and it's connected to the song, the wonderful Maria Tănase song. I was just before this Zoom call, I went for a walk in the very rainy fields of North Hampshire, and I was actually listening to the Maria Tănase song, and I was thinking, actually, it's actually it does something, doesn't it, to your blood? It does something to it is about that kind of that instinct. It's about that those primitive forces that kind of unleashed by music in the young aristocrat, and yes, he wants to possess the dance, and he wants to possess the woman. And interestingly, a lot of it is kind of framed in terms of the male gaze as well. It's the kind of the gaze of the rich person observing the spectacle of the peasant, but it's also the male gaze as well. In fact, when they watch the Ciuleandra dance, it talks about how they watched it as if from a box at the theatre. And one of the times when he realizes, like, maybe why he killed her is because she returns his gaze. She's no longer the passive object of his gaze, but she is the one who looks at him, and in his eyes she sees that he's not the person in her heart, that actually he hadn't managed to fully own her because, and again, I don't want to completely spoil the book for people, because her heart belonged to somebody else, and so she kept a little bit of that autonomy there. So it is very interesting, but I think as well, like going back to the song, the Ciuleandra, and that sense of obsession and the kind of the powers that the music unleash, or the kind of the demons that the music unleash in the person. It's interesting because normally those kind of instinctual urges would be associated with the rural world, but what's interesting is the way that Liviu Rebreanu has made the ones who are supposed to be the most controlled, the most refined, the most sophisticated, you know, speaking French, going to Switzerland, going to Paris, but they're the ones that have these instinctual urges that they can't control and go about murdering their wives and so on. So it's that kind of reversal of the expectations, I think, is very interesting.
So anyway, I came back from the war a sub-lieutenant like everyone else. I hadn't seen any action, of course. I hadn't been anywhere near a battlefield. My father was very careful that I shouldn't become a hero. And then, as soon as I was out of uniform, he told me that he wanted to see me married. Straight away. Very well then. Let him find me a wife, and I would be ready. But before he could, he made a gesture with his hand. I don't know how he was planning to find a girl to my liking. I never asked him. Still, one Sunday, the old man decided that we would drive to my uncle's estate in Argeș, Mănești, and spend around 3 days there. We were supposed to leave early so that we would get there at midday, but because my father had some unforeseen business, to attend to. It was almost lunchtime before we left. We estimated we would arrive there at 3. On account of bad roads and our worn tires, my father has always been mean when it comes to spending money on the car. We had several minor breakdowns, so that it was already 5 by the time we decided to stop in a village at least an hour away from Mănești. We were running out of petrol and starving, and then we chanced upon this inn by the side of the road, a miserable place, just like the rest of the village. But what could we do? We stopped there to grab something to eat and for the chauffeur to refuel the car. The innkeeper, a very shady character, insisted on preparing us a banquet and suggested that we should go and watch the village dance, saying that there would be many beautiful girls there and that the dance would take place just near the backyard of the inn. Now, because we didn't seem keen, the innkeeper insisted. You must see the Ciuleandra, if nothing else. They don't dance it anywhere like we do here. Our fiddlers are the best. It's a fine thing to see. Yes. Ciuleandra, the doctor murmured very quietly, listening with a cold gleam in his eyes. Have you heard of this strange dance before? Puiu cut in immediately, surprised and delighted at the same time. Yes, the doctor replied, unexpectedly startled, immediately regretting that the words had escaped his mouth. There was a pause. Puiu smiled confusedly, waiting for the doctor to continue. Then, frustrated by his long silence, he resumed his story, irritably. Well, yes, Ciuleandra. Anyway, the innkeeper led us to a veranda from which we could watch the dance as if from a box at the theatre. At first, perhaps because I was hungry, I didn't think it was anything special. It was a village gathering like any others. The girls were so-so, the lads even less impressive. Besides, their dancing was fairly ordinary, spiritless. And then the Ciuleandra began. Well, doctor, anyone who hasn't watched the Ciuleandra could never understand how intoxicating it is, Puiu exclaimed fervently, his eyes burning with ecstasy. It starts just like any other dance, very slow, very restrained. The dancers gather, form a circle, choose their partners, guided by lust or maybe at random. Stirred by the heat of those bodies, the music quickens, grows wilder. The rhythm of the dance catches its frenzy. The dancers, gripping each other by the waist, build out of the bodies a wall that sways, tilts, writhes and trembles, enthralled to the music. As the fiddlers warm to their instruments, the melody twitches, spins loose, explodes into chaos. Sparks seem to fly as the lads scissor their legs, pounding the dust, leaping fearlessly through the air, shrieking with delight. And then suddenly everyone swept up in a whirlwind, tearing the ground with sharp, swift kicks, flying. The living wall sways right, sways left. The fiddlers mercilessly pinch at their string, the sound sharpened and coarsened by their savage cries, mirroring each other, then swallowed back into the tide of the rhythm. And now the circle, spinning and coiling tighter like a formidable snake, begins to shrink, collapses onto itself until it becomes a heap of burning flesh that writhes, fixed in the center. For a moment, only to loosen all of a sudden, mollified, tame, exposing the raw, scorching joy branded on the dancers' faces. But the musicians, vexed by this law, must have their revenge, and their tune screeches out, harder, deeper, more insistent, the ring of dancers daring themselves to defy and smother the music's spells, charge at it, feet crushing into the dirt, and the tornado of flesh twists into itself again, tighter, more stubborn, clenching and loosening, until finally the bodies melt into each other like a fallen harvest. there, fixed in that spot for a few minutes, for an eternity, possessed by the same maniacal rhythm the bodies of men and women knead into each other, quivering, thrumming. Once in a while the simmering passion is pierced by long shrieks, erupting as if from ancient depths, or by startled cry of a girl whose breasts were clenched too tightly. And that's how it would go on, until each dancer's soul melted into that all-encompassing flame of unbridled passion. But then, abruptly, like a cord sharply cut, the rhythm suddenly unravels and the young bodies splinter away with hoots of savage laughter and groans of pleasure satisfied, so that even the valleys seem to fill with trembling, as if the fury of human passion had unleashed the suppressed tremors of lust asleep in the earth.
But is it though? I mean, is it a reversal, or is it just goes with what actually the reality of things? And this is what I think Rebreanu is brilliant in capturing that tension, because ultimately this is a meditation on modernity. And you know, not to go back to to my own research, but this is what this is about. There is a tension there between a sort of superimposed modernity, because the boyars ultimately still live in a feudal sort of society. In their mind, they're at the top of the game. They are at the top of social mores, of economic status, and so on. So what ultimately happens is that they see that position being eroded by modernity. As you mentioned earlier, you know, you see doctors coming out of rural areas, moving to the urban spaces and all that, and whether they fit in there or not, obviously they don't play by the rules. They don't play by the rules of this society. You know, they do their own thing. But in the same time, they are the ones who will, in the end, switch and turn things around. And what the nobles try to do, what the nobility is trying to do, is maintain the status quo. I mean, look at this. Look at the society that we have on the side of the Farangas. And we're talking corruption. We're talking bribery. We're talking nepotism. We're talking, I mean, we're dealing with a murder, and the idea is that how do we make it so that the person who committed murder doesn't really pay for it? Is not accountable. Because why? Because the rules of the modern state don't apply. You know, they don't apply to these people because they know everybody. They're politicians. There's a lot of corruption there, and this is indeed the struggle that we see in the novel. The Farangas cannot keep on or hold on to that to those privileges, and that's the issue. So I find that very interesting, because it aligns with other novels in the period. And I think I mentioned in my introduction Matei Caragiale's Crai de Curtea Veche, The Rakes of the Old Court, just recently retranslated as well into English. But also, if you think about all the cycle of the Halipas, Hortensia Papadopengescu's, and of course the most famous of all is the concert of Bach music. But there are several of these groups of noble people that are being now put in a position of being overturned, overthrown, overtaken by the new modern world, and they're resisting it. They're keeping back. Ciuleandra is about that, right? I mean, I would put Ciuleandra in that group with Caragiale and Papadopengescu.
Yes, I know. I think that's right. I think, but at the same time, to me, I saw also kind of that attraction and repulsion in the book towards the rural world, the kind of both the fear but also the attraction that I think you could see in other writings in the interwar era, like philosophers and people who had nationalist ideas as well, because they were talking. You mentioned before about how the old man Faranga is obsessed with this idea of blood, and the blood needing to be rejuvenated because it's old, corrupted blood. It's no good anymore, so it needs to be rejuvenated. And yes, I mean, to some extent, that actually links in with a lot of the discourse during that time about blood and about origins and about what is it that makes somebody, Romanian or German or whatever. And it is kind of, there's a lot of idealization as well of rural life. So on one hand, you have the sense that modernity is coming and people's positions are being threatened by the rise of the middle classes, and these people no longer being part of this feudal system, although things are changing very slowly in some places.
Right.
At the same time, there's this other discourse that supposedly celebrates this less corrupt, more primitive group of people, and so that desire that old Mr. Faranga has for his own family to be reconnected to that actually mirrors some of the discourse of the time about people needing to reconnect or with the traditional folk roots as well, and it comes from romanticism, doesn't it? It comes that idea of nationalism, and I think it's reflected there. Hence the relationship to the rural world. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to the roots of enlightenment. It goes back to the roots of the entire idea of modernity. And I keep saying this about Romania. If you think about the role of the founders of modernity in Romania, the first theorists, Tito Maiorescu, going back to the 1848 movement, you see there that there is an interpretation of what French and English modernity was supposed to be, what culture and civilization meant for the French, for the English theories. That's where Maiorescu was looking, and then for the Germans as well. And he's trying to adapt it to Romania. He's trying to actually put it on Romania, and it ends up with kind of like a build it and they shall come type of thing. If we build modernity, they will come. As long as we have the forms. And then again, he's the one who criticizes the forms without content and so on. But ultimately, it is his doing that we end up with building a parliament and building a constitutional monarchy and building a new society, while all these other elements, the boyars part of it, right, are still there. They're still in place and they're still maintaining power. So in the end, there is this tension, this constant tension between what we want it to be, a new modern nation, with obviously complete territory determined by the Enlightenment ideas of, all people who speak Romanian and who follow this culture rules and so on have to be in a nation. But then that creates all these other tensions that we see resulting in the ultimate decay of the nobility and that a society that has no longer any roots in this new society, in this new reality. Yeah. So it's an interesting little novel that captures all of that. If you look at it with a bird's eye view kind of thing, you see how it captures all of those tensions in. But Gabi, I wanted to ask you also. Yeah, I keep going back to the translation and the wonderful job you did on that. So you looked at other interwar novels. And you talked about, we know you translated Sebastian, and you talked about, Sebastian is very interesting because his style is completely different from somebody like Rebreanu. And this brings, of course, the conversation about the nature of the Romanian novel and how novels, of course, are connected with the actual nation state and the modern nation. If you think back to Mikhail Bakhtin and his theories on literature and the birth of modern literature, and Sebastian, of course, is looking at it from a different perspective, from the Jewishness perspective, which is a minority, which is a group that's on the fringes within a fringe modernity. But that's a larger conversation for another time, perhaps. So I want to go back to the stylistic challenges that you might have encountered in translating Rebreanu's Ciuleandra. This was the first time you translated Rebreanu, right?
Yes, yeah, no,
Right.
yes. I mean, I think I mentioned a little bit about the intensity and the drama of the style, and particularly at the beginning, there were lots of question marks and lots of reporting clauses that were like he cried or he shouted, and if they're like, gosh, this is getting a little bit much. So kind of going, I mean, it's okay. I mean, because he had just killed his wife, so you feel it's justifiable. At that point, particularly the beginning of it, I felt it was very different from Mihail Sebastian, which was very restrained, very understated. It's,
Yes.
relationships break up and, he doesn't bat an eyelid, it's all kind of, it's all based on this idea of being kind of very modern, cool, detached, expecting dreadful things to happen all the time. So that's kind of pretty much, I think, Sebastian's trademark.
Right,
But
right.
starts in such a dramatic way, and because, like I said, it's got these overlaps with melodrama, also with sensation fiction and so on. I think it was justified, but it was just that sense of how do you slightly try to rein it in so it doesn't become very repetitive, and trying to use the whole gamut of the English language to kind of get in that emotion there, rather than perhaps keeping it all at that high pitch with he shouted, he cried, and so on.
Right.
So that was it at the beginning, but actually I think that, I don't know, you might, whether you agree, but as the novel goes on, it slows down as he starts to spend time alone in the sanatorium room, locked up, without any contact to the social world, as we've all been used to, although not in a sanatorium, but without having the distraction of friends, of parties, of the social life. He withdraws in himself, the pace slows down, and there are some similarities there actually with the way that Sebastian, especially in the town of the acacia trees, shows people's emotions and their psychology very realistically and subtly as well. And we're going to hopefully have an extract read to us rather than me reading it now. But one of my favorite parts is the way that he starts thinking about why he did it, and it starts with him thinking there was one question, why. He just couldn't remember, he couldn't understand why he killed his wife, which is an amazing thing, really. So, but he starts blaming it on all sorts of different things, and
Yeah.
which start quite logical at first, and in the extract it's about how he thinks that maybe he's got a killer instinct. So it all starts fairly logical. Yes, I think I might have had a killer instinct. I used to enjoy watching chickens being killed in the kitchen. And then, but by the end of it, it goes to a completely illogical point that if only my father had let me go to war and kill some people, I wouldn't have killed my wife. But I love that kind of wonderful journey from like something quite logical to something quite absurd, because it explains, I think, very realistically his mental breakdown, but also just the desperation that everybody has to try to understand why things are happening to them. And he goes from blaming fate to blaming his father and his parents, which, like, fair enough, why not? But he kind of goes through all these different possible reasons why he is who he is, and that is, I think, something that Mihail Sebastian does a lot in The Town with Acacia Trees, as he shows two people growing up. But it kind of, the pace certainly slows down. It becomes much more of a psychological Dostoevskian kind of writing, I think, rather than the melodrama at the beginning, and I was very, very interested in that, actually.
Like the broken tip of an arrow, a fragment of a burning question burrowed in his mind. Why? It didn't take long for the question to formulate itself complete. Why did I kill her? But he balked at this new question that nagged at him, demanding an answer that didn't exist. Finally, no longer able to bear it, he jumped to his feet and shouted louder as if to chase away a ghostly shadow. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. His answer and the shrillness with which he had uttered it confounded him further. He looked towards the door, alarmed that the guard might have heard him and might consider him truly mad for taking aloud to himself. He commenced once again his nauseating march around the room, when a thought flew into his mind. I wonder how many thousands of times I will pace up and down like this before. He couldn't finish his thought, finding himself by the window. An idea suddenly presented itself to him, and he clung to it like a lifeline. If I couldn't control myself in the way that God managed to, then that means that I was born with a criminal instinct. The notion brought with it the natural conclusion that he couldn't be held accountable for his crime, as fate has poisoned his blood with an irresistible predisposition to violence. He must have carried this malady in his blood for many years, yet heroically managed to suppress it. But in the end, in a moment of weakness, the unconquerable instinct took him by surprise, numbed his moral resistance, and compelled him to fulfill his destiny and become a murderer. In the same way that he had murdered Madeleine, he might have killed anyone, like Tante Matilda, for instance, if she had arrived that evening on time, or maybe even his own father. The instinct did not target a specific victim, but would have been satisfied by any corpse, regardless of whose it was. And his accountability, in either case, would have been the same. A crime presupposes a question of will, but his crime? If things had been different, he might have been born with the instinct to commit suicide rather than murder. In that case, instead of taking Madeleine's life, he would have hurled himself off the window, or buried his head in the smouldering embers of the fireplace. He could see in a new light certain bizarre events from the past that he had never taken seriously, and which had never troubled his conscience, consumed as he had been by the trivial trappings of daily life. Even his father's treatment of him seemed odd, although he hadn't realized it until now. For example, how he tried to shelter him from the company of violent friends, or how reluctant he was to allow him to hunt, only giving in after much persuasion and with a heavy heart. He remembered his father's words now, even though he had not taken them seriously at the time. It's not good for you to get accustomed to spilling the blood of any creature, even an animal. And later, all of a sudden, he has said, I suppose that at the end of the day, it's better for you to satisfy your killing instinct by shooting rabbits and pheasants. A little while before his wedding, not long after he had become engaged to Madeleine, he had got into a serious scuffle with his old friend Costel Plagiano over a woman, of course. He had slapped him, therefore they were required to fight in a duel. By the time the old man found out, the witnesses had already chosen the sword as the weapon for the duel and settled that it should take place the following day in a nearby field. Puiu was feeling relaxed about the fight. He was an accomplished swordsman, and he had a special maneuver that no man had yet managed to block. He had joked with one of the witnesses that he would even give Costel a cut in his father's honor, so that he could learn a lesson not to be disrespectful to anyone. His father, however, despite knowing Puiu's reputation as a redoubtable fencer, or as he now contemplated because of it, did everything in his power to prevent the duel, and in the end it didn't take place. In the evening he told him in no uncertain terms, I don't want my son to be a killer, not even in a duel. Puiu was now convinced that the old man knew of the terrible corruption of the blood that burdened his only son and tried to do all he could to save him from it. Poor father, he thought, strangled by emotion. How he must have suffered because of me. And yet if only he had warned me, maybe I could have stopped myself. I could have tried to overcome this evil inside me. He called Lahu to make his bed. The room was now dark, but he didn't turn on the light. He remembered how quickly he had fallen asleep the previous evening, and he hoped it would be the same tonight, aching for the night to soothe him and clear away his thoughts. In fact, as he watched the guard making his bed, he thought how wonderful it would be if he could sleep for 3 months and only wake up once everything had been resolved in his absence. He slipped under the covers and ordered a man to turn off the electric light. He turned his face to the wall just like yesterday. As he was going to sleep, he tried to summon from his memory other moments when the evil in his blood had surfaced. It was not long before countless incidents floated through the mind's mirror. The pleasure he felt as a child, watching the cook cut the necks of chickens in the kitchen. How he would rush to press his hand on that headless body that writhed wildly, splattering blood in every direction. He felt again disgusted. The burning of his bitter tears when the governess had held him back by force when he wanted to touch a decapitated hen. And then his strange, irresistible instinct that overcame him at the peak of his passion to crush the woman in a mighty embrace, or stifle her breath with one last kiss. Many women had called him a sadist, sometimes jokingly, sometimes not. Even with Madeleine, the first time he saw her, he had the impulse to clutch her to his chest until her life drained away. And to think that he had regarded this perversity as a sign of overpowering love.
And I again, that makes it such a wonderful little jewel of literature, because it encapsulates, I think, on one hand, this attempt. It's an attempt from Rebreanu to sort of go into the depth of the human mind in a Dostoevskian way, as you say, but at the same time, it also brings together that thread that Rebreanu is so fond of the peasant description, of the sort of more Narodnik, Gorkian sort of influence that you see on him in Ion, in Răscoala, right? So these the two sort of sit in a balance. I mean, in a way, if you will indulge me here, Ciuleandra is Rebreanu's own struggle with modernity. He's trying to overcome that desire to describe peasant life, but he's so brilliant at it that he can't really eliminate it, and then he wants to plunge into something else. And right there in those pages, just like with Matei Caragiale, I think, in those few pages, we have the struggle of the building of the Romanian modern novel. It is exactly that. It's there, if you look at the beginnings, shy beginnings of the Romanian modern novel tradition, at the Ciocoi Vechi și Noi, and at the older novels that are the first attempts of capturing what it means to live in this north of the Danube society, right? in the 18th, 19th century. And then you get to the 20th century and we're still kind of grappling, but people are coming to terms of what we are, who we are as a nation, and we capture that. So then you have a string of good modernist writers, with Sadovanu, of course, with Rebreanu, with Istrati, with Papadabăngeș, with Camil Petrescu, Eliade, and so on, who are able then to capture all these different aspects. What Rebreanu does, he tries in 9 novels to capture them all. He puts them all together. So there's like, your murder novel and the mystery novel and the romance novel and the peasant novel and all. And then you have the Dostoevskian psychological introspection novel in Ciuleandra. So he's a fascinating, I mean, I've always loved Rebreanu's work. And he's a fascinating literary sort of character.
Yeah, lovely. I think you've summed it up so nicely. That would be a nice place to end it. And
all right.
It's such a pleasure talking to you about this, actually, and and having who's been as close to the book as I have been over the last couple of years. And thank you as well for your amazing introduction. I learned a lot as well from it, about Liviu Rebreanu and seeing the book in context. So yeah, I think that might be kind of a good place to stop, actually, because you can that. So,
thank you as well, Gabi.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Lately, Puiu wore a bitter smile at his permanent mask. On the day of Madeleine's funeral, he realized that he would only be able to find the comfort and tranquility he needed to endure the troubles ahead by retreating in his very own soul. Although his father and Aunt Matilda were the two people he felt closest to, on that day, it became clearer to him that they were strangers to the torment of his heart. It dawned on him at last that every man is alone in his darkest hour. He became more and more convinced that he was stranded in a separate world, a world filled with confusion that had broken all ties except, in a practical sense, with a realm where others continue their lives. People, he reflected, spend their lives communicating through conventional signs and thus live under the illusion that they understand each other. In reality, we attribute our feelings to others, and that which we call empathy, it's merely a mirror of our own souls. The only meaningful tie we have is with God, as only He who has fashioned our consciousness can truly understand us. Our greatest joys and sorrows we experience alone, cutting deep into our soul, so that in those moments we might feel the sharpest sting of solitude.